So in this book, Byzantine Theology, Father John writes, our conclusion to these brief comments on Dionysius must be, therefore, that in areas where he transcends Neoplatonism, the area of the theologia, he is a real Christian without, however, being truly original. But that his doctrine of the hierarchies, even if it represents a genuine attempt to integrate the Neoplatonic worldview into the Christian framework, is an obvious failure, the consequences of which have led to much confusion, especially in the fields of liturgy and of ecclesiological formulations. One wonders, too, if the Western scholastic doctrine of the sacerdotal character, and to a lesser extent the confusion frequent in the Byzantine East between the role of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and that of holy men, do not go back ultimately to Dionysius. So how would you respond to that? What is your take on
I loved Father John Meyendorff. He was a dedicated teacher, a wonderful scholar, and a very Christian man. But he once confessed to me, this was after I had finished my dissertation, had come back from England, that he thought perhaps he had followed the scholarly consensus on Dionysius a little too closely. His opinion on the Areopagitical corpus is very much in accord with that consensus. Probably he gives Dionysius a bit more credit for being Christian than most, because he rightly saw that the apophatic theology of the mystical theology, that the theology of the Trinity, and indeed of Christology, was fully in accord with especially the 4th century writers like the Cappadocian Fathers. But he didn't really get hierarchy and what Dennis meant by that. He saw the triads and thought Neoplatonism. Well, Neoplatonism, late Neoplatonism, certainly like triads. But that was in the service of a descending a descending series of causes. And in a way, the projection of rational thought onto the macrocosmos. This is not what Dionysius was about in hierarchies. All the causal business is simply removed, and expressly. So what was he talking about when he uses, and in fact invents the word hierarchy? Because we don't find it anywhere before him. On the other hand, after him, it's an instant hit. And you see it everywhere. He didn't invent the word hierarch. That was apparently around in Greek antiquity before him. And my own suspicion is that he chose it because, first of all, it probably comes from the mystery cults in the antique world, something like Hierophant or along those lines, but that it was the closest thing he could find in the pagan literature that he was, to an extent, mimicking to support his assumption of the identity of Dionysius the Areopagite, who was converted by St. Paul on the Areopagus, and therefore a philosopher of some kind, because it was the closest thing he could come in the Greek of late antiquity to the word high priest, archierevs in Greek, which thus, I think, gives us our clue, our fundamental clue. In a way, he expresses it in so many words in Ecclesiastical Hierarchy 5, where he talks about the legal hierarchy. I mean, referring to the Old Testament. And what he refers to is the structure of worship as presented in Exodus 25 following. The revelation of the plans for the tabernacle, the vestments of the priests, and later on in Leviticus of the kind of central rite of ancient Israel, the rites of the Day of Atonement, when once, the only time in the year, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies before the divine presence and sacrifice, bring blood into the temple. There was no blood sacrifice inside the temple or the tabernacle. It's outside. The only time blood entered was on that day when he came to sprinkle the blood for his sins and the sins of Israel. That's what the whole epistle to the Hebrews is built on. So what we come to is the notion of hierarchy as liturgy. That is the fundamental sense. And what MS does, in my view, is that he expresses in this kind of outre language, the language of the mystery cults in late antiquity, he expresses something quite fundamental already to the Church's understanding that the liturgy is somehow the center of it, that we meet God in the liturgy, that the liturgy is a revelation. It's like the story which I've told on several occasions, I don't think for any of these interviews, but on several occasions, of one of my students, back in the day before I had him as a graduate student, was courting his wife-to-be. And she was a biblical scholar and a Protestant, so a believer, but unfamiliar with this form of Christianity. And he wanted to be a priest, so she had to become Orthodox, and he was wondering, how do I do that? So he thought, well, maybe the best thing to do is to bring her to a church. Let her see. And he was right, as it turned out. So he brings her to an Orthodox church, not during a service, just a church. And steps back and lets her take it in. And she looks around, frowns, looks around some more, looks thoughtful, and then brightens and says, oh, yes, apocalypse. And it happens she was just exactly right. Because the liturgy is apocalypse. It is the unveiling, the revelation of the divine presence. And by the way, the apocalypse, the book, is very much liturgical. You can't read chapters 4 and 5, for example, without thinking liturgy. Even has antiphonal choirs. So that's the first thing that Father John didn't see, and very few scholars saw. That this is about liturgy. And liturgy is apocalypse, and it's fundamental to his incorporation of liturgy into the apophatic ascent. Or put another way, the connection of the altar with the peak of Sinai, as well as the Holy of Holies. And it happens that this is also, in this respect, he is also drawing on a tradition which was already very present in the Church of Syria, especially the Syriac-speaking Christians, and especially among their ascetics. What a late 4th century writer, whose name we don't know, he wrote a book called The Book of Steps. And in its 12th discourse, he talks about the necessity of the worship of the church on earth as enabling what he calls the church of the soul, the heart, to enter into the church of heaven, the liturgy of the angels around the throne of God, Christ. And that without that middle, the church on earth, one cannot, the soul, the heart, cannot migrate. And it is the necessary link. And Ephraim of Syria, even before that, had put in parallel the tree of life in paradise, the Holy of Holies, the altar of the church, and the heart of the Christian in apposition. So Moses' entry into the darkness of unknowing, which is also the, as Dionysius says, expressly quoting 1 Timothy 6:16, which is also the unapproachable light in which God dwells, and also the Holy of Holies, the divine presence. So we approach the altar to commune, and this action should be impressing on us, as it were, the entry into heaven itself and the meeting with God. So all these are coordinated, and he says so expressly at the beginning of the celestial hierarchy. And in Celestial Hierarchy chapter 3, he, as it were, puts an extra emphasis on it. Not only is this a kind of necessary correlation, heaven, earth, and the soul, with the earth, that is the liturgy on earth, being the kind of via, the way, the link, but also this worship, this liturgy, this God-revealed worship, stamps the soul. He uses a strong word. He says, apotypo. The soul is shaped by the liturgy. Now that's new. I hadn't seen that in the ascetic predecessors like the writer of the Book of Steps or Ephraim or the Macarian homilies, which have the same idea, but they don't have that. So as it were, he emphasizes it. And this brought me, this is what I think answers the question, why did everyone like this guy? I mean, if Father John's take is true, and he's much milder than most of them out there, if that's true, then why did they like this guy? If he's importing something alien and strange, why would the apostolic pseudonym have been sufficient? No. The answer is simple no, because there are all kinds of documents floating around with apostolic names attached to them. And they certainly didn't find their way into any kind of general canon or reception, although a lot of them were valued. And rightly. I mean, all the monastic libraries that are full of what Protestants call Old Testament pseudepigrapha, books of Enoch, variants, the testaments of the patriarchs, so on and so on and so on, and the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles. Well, those aren't genuine in the sense of being first century, but they're certainly witnesses to a spirituality, sometimes a little bit out of kilter, but a spirituality that was real and which monks in succeeding generations thought valuable and continued to copy in Russia into the 18th and 19th centuries. Slavonic Enoch exists in 18th century manuscript copies. They're still, or 19th century, they're still copying it because they still value it. And why do they value it? Because they saw in it revelations and confirmations of that experience of God which they themselves saw. So, Father John missed this, but everyone else had too. Among the scholarly community, I think the monks always knew it. Why Maximus picks up on it immediately. I mean, his mystagogy is very, I think, Dionysian. It's a series of images, yes, of the liturgy of the church. He's talking about the church building, less about the particular rite, but the structure of the church building. As an image of God, an image of the world, an image of the human being, an image of the soul, an image of the soul in union with God. Well, this is exactly as he says in his mystagogy. This is saying some things clearly that Dionysius leaves for us to, fill out. He says that. He says, I won't repeat what he said. I'm simply going to bring some things up that he left for us to say. Expressly. So Father John didn't pick up on that, but no one else had either. He said the monks had. The one point that he raises, which I think is correct, there is a confusion between the high priest, the bishop, hierarch, and the holy man, a kind of identity, of sort of fusion in the Dionysian corpus. And in terms of actual people, that's just false. Bishops aren't holy men necessarily. The office is. The office is everything that he says it is. The office is clothed with as we say in the prayer of the Cherubicum, what is clothed with the grace of the high priesthood. Yes. But the man underneath the clothing isn't necessarily any better, maybe often worse than other people. And the monks rightly ignore that. The whole monastic reception right at the end of the busy night, that they just pass over that. They graciously, as it were, ignore that. The bishops love it. There's a kind of, you could say there's a kind of bifurcation in the reception of Dionysius, whether you're a monk, monastic, or bishops. The bishops all leap on that. Yes. The monks, as I said, ignore. So that's my take on it.